During the 1980s, a pedophile ring allegedly operated in Port Elizabeth. Young coloured boys are said to have been kidnapped and would sometimes disappear without a trace. In 1987, the story broke when two of the alleged members of the ring allegedly committed suicide within a month of each other. John Wiley, Minister of Tourism and Environmental Affairs, and his close friend Dave Allen, who was also rumoured to be his lover. Murmurs of the ruthless Minister of Defence Magnus Malan's involvement surfaced but were quickly silenced. In part 1, we looked at the role allegedly played by Dave Allen, a central figure of the alleged pedophile ring. In this episode, we travel to the Eastern Cape in search of victims and affected community members who recall a time when the kidnapping and alleged rape of boys from the northern areas of Port Elizabeth terrified their community.
Up until now, when I read the book, I realized this is true, and unfortunately, Vinky Vai was a victim of this.
They told me that they were being picked up by a white man in a bakkie near to McGuinness Park, which is in the center of town.
It's really important to point out that many of those children were street children. Many of them did not even make it. Those who didn't make it were already so vulnerable that it's not a surprise that they ended up as drug addicts or alcoholics.
3 decades later, these revelations have resurfaced in a book and are causing ripples in the predominantly coloured areas in Port Elizabeth, where it is believed the victims were recruited from. The northern areas of Port Elizabeth are plagued by poverty, gangsterism and drug abuse. They were formed during the forced removals of the 1950s after coloured communities were evacuated from their homes under the apartheid government. The area has a high unemployment rate. In the 1980s, it was defined by political turmoil. The youth of Port Elizabeth were on the forefront of political activism. Many were detained and tortured under the repressive apartheid state. It is also during this time that young boys from Port Elizabeth were allegedly targeted by a pedophile ring which allegedly consisted of senior politicians. 17-year-old Vinky Vai was a well-known singer in the area. He sang with the then popular musician Ricardo Green. After his brief debut on the hit song I Love You Daddy, he disappeared into obscurity and died several years later due to a drug overdose. According to his family, his drug addiction turned him into a troubled teenager who frequently hung out in this area where a notorious cafe called City Snacks used to operate. After reading the recently released book, The Lost Boys of Bird Island, his cousin, who prefers to remain anonymous, believes that he could have been abused on Bird Island. She recalls him being taken in a blue kumbi by unknown men. At the time, there was an urban legend of the blue kumbi as well as the balloon woman who allegedly kidnapped young children.
What I can remember is, vividly what I can remember is that Vinky Vai, he went missing for a few days, few weeks, and would come back. Then my granny never asked him where he was because that was his ways, disappearing and then just coming back. But then it was a rumor that he was also a victim of this, of being picked up by this blue kumbi. And to me, this book just gave me, it made me remember that Vinky Vai is a victim of this, because this blue kumbi, according to us that time, even now before the book came out, and since I read the book, for us it was a myth. And to just realize now it wasn't a myth. It was in actual fact, it was true. And I know that, I think I was 16, 17 years old at the time that Vinky Vai, that he went missing, he disappeared and he come back. I know he was under social workers social workers would bring him back, those years, the SAP bring him back, then you could see that he was assaulted wherever he was. And in this area we are in now, this is the area where Vinkiva used to stay, the street. He used to stay here. We never saw the blue kumbi. I never saw the blue kumbi. Maybe somebody else or other children that we grew up with. We were just warned about the blue kumbi. And look, those days, the adults, they never talked in front of the children, especially about things like that. They just warned us. We cannot ask questions. So to us, it was a myth. Up until now, when I read the book, I realized this is true, and unfortunately, Vinkiva was a victim of this.
Alleged pedophile and recruiter for the reported pedophile ring, Dave Allen, used to frequent cafes in Port Elizabeth where young boys used to hang out. It is widely rumoured in this community that he was the driver of the Blue Kumbi that recruited young victims and that he offered them money and drugs in exchange for sex. He was a keen diver whose hobby was recovering and selling artifacts from shipwrecks around Bird Island archipelago off the coast of Port Elizabeth. Allen's close friend, the then Minister of Fisheries, John Wiley, is said to have looked after his interests by putting laws in place to protect shipwrecks from being poached and placed tight controls on the industry. Their friendship catapulted Allen into high society, where he partied with the rich, famous and politically elite.
If you asked a Russian about the best way to drink vodka, he'd tell you to drink it at sub-zero temperature, filled with a pickle. We'd probably say, just serve it over ice with a splash of lime, and put the pickle on a sandwich. Tops at Spa. Good vodka, good advice. No hypothermia.
Township under siege, roads blockaded, and the atmosphere here remains tense. Residents want their houses damaged by the storms repaired.
Raids are coming. Who's going to repair my furniture?
Police remain vigilant.
We may never have sufficient members, but the members that we have, we are comfortable with them. We are in a position to deal with the situation.
From us also as councillors, we lack information as it's not cascaded to us.
The Cape Times of March the 30th, 1987. Headlines: John Wiley found shot dead. The article alludes to the fact that the then Minister of Environment and Water Affairs may have killed himself. A few pages later, there is another article that says, friend of Wiley also took own life. In this article, the brother of David Allen states that John Wiley and David Allen had a strong friendship for more than 10 years. Wiley's political history includes his expulsion from the United Party in 1977 for his right-wing stance. He found a political home in the National Party in 1980, where he became Minister of Environment and Tourism. He slated the English press for being too liberal and considered them to be a danger to society. Ironically, he also called for the castration of rapists, yet he is alleged to have been a key member of the notorious paedophile ring. According to the book, Dave Allen allegedly recruited young boys for him and other high-profile politicians for forays to Bird Island. Our search for deceased and living victims lead us to Benedicta Carew, who worked in the Helenvale area of Port Elizabeth as a community worker during the 1980s. She's a member of the Northern Areas Concerned Citizens Group, which runs soup kitchens in impoverished areas like Missionvale in Port Elizabeth. She has a vivid recollection of an incident involving the rape of a little girl by the troubled youth Vinkiva in 1988.
we met a family, a lady whose little girl was raped. And at the time, I didn't see, but I heard from the people in the community. The guy's name was Winky Vai, and he had raped this little girl, and people were talking about the incident and also about him. And I remember being shocked to hear that it's the same person that was singing at some time with Ricardo Green. And I was sad because I thought, this boy, the whole future ahead of him, what could have made him do this or go to that level in his life?
An experienced community worker, she says she was not surprised to later discover that Winky Vai was himself a victim of sexual abuse.
It didn't really surprise me because normally when people are rapists, they normally come from a background where they were victimized themselves, being unemployed, you know, hanging out in Shebeen yards and things. I thought to myself, what made him go back to that? He had his future ahead of him. He was involved with the singing, and they were doing quite well, the last I heard of.
In 1985 and 1988, states of emergencies were declared by the government. Many of the schools in the northern areas were targeted by the notorious security branch. Some former teachers like Hope Malgas were detained for their anti-government political views. Malgas was jailed for several months in the 1980s. Today, she serves as a member of parliament in the local government of the Bay.
During that period, life within our areas were very turbulent. And we always felt as the educators at the school, the community. And we felt it with them that we were being oppressed and we were being repressed. Because there were many times, at the school I was teaching at, that was Acadia High, that the security branch and the soldiers came onto our school ground, and they used to beat up our children. They used to pull guns, and they used to threaten people. There were many fears. It was actually a frenzy. It's almost like a frenzy that we are experiencing now with the kidnapping, which is another story of our children. And the fact that we'll always say that you'll have to look after your children, because we had something like a kumbi that used to ride up and down in the area. And I always used to remember the kumbi was always sighted at West End Primary, and that they were really kidnapping our children, but we didn't know for what.
At the launch of the book, we interviewed co-author Chris Steyn, who says that the poor areas in Port Elizabeth were targeted by the pedophiles because of the many social problems in an area with high levels of unemployment. She says that the reason for the victims' continued silence is their overwhelming fear of what would happen to them if they named their rapists.
Every day we are getting better victim information than we've had before. And I think it's really important to point out that many of those children were street children. Many of them did not even make it. Those who didn't make it were already so vulnerable that it's not a surprise that they ended up as drug addicts or alcoholics. They are not the people who are queuing up in exclusives with a platinum card to buy the book. Some of them will probably not even ever know it's been written. And then we have people who have made it out of that situation. For instance, they are two abroad. They're married, they have families. It's not where they want to go. I spoke of another victim who holds a very highly respectable position now. And it's going to be a challenge for us to convince him to speak about what's happened to him. But I'm confident that there will one day be justice for the victims, even if not all of them will know it.
In the 1980s, the northern areas of Port Elizabeth were allegedly targeted by a pedophile ring involving powerful politicians who would kidnap and rape young boys, some of whom disappeared and are thought to have been murdered. A recent book on the subject, The Lost Boys of Bird Island, was co-written by Mark Minnie, a former cop from Uitenhage who was found dead a few weeks before the book was launched. Uitenhage was one of the areas that the boys were allegedly recruited from, mostly around McGuinness Park in the centre of town. Minnie, who had been living in China, was in South Africa for the launch of his book. His body was found on this farm in Thieskom outside of Port Elizabeth, where, according to the police, a weapon was found next to his body.
We can confirm that the body of the 58-year-old man found in a small hole in Thieskom is that of Mark Minnie. He was found last night with a gunshot wound to his head. A pistol was found lying next to him. We have opened an inquest docket.
Contrary to some reports of suicide, members of his family who attended his memorial service believed that Minnie had no reason to take his life.
My memory of him was I couldn't listen. No matter what time at night, and he would come and wake me and says, "Get up, get up. I'm an iron trouser, my shirt, I'm going on a hot date."
As a family, yes, it's difficult, and many of us don't believe that it was a suicide attempt. Obviously, knowing him and the way he felt about things like that. So, but yeah, it's an ongoing investigation. Don't want to say too much about that.
He has been mentioning it to us for quite a long time. I spoke to a couple of my cousins today, and to all of them he expressed that his life was in danger, and that if anything did happen to him, we must know that it was done to him, not by himself. The family is saying that it wasn't in Mark's nature. Mark was not a coward. Mark faced life head on. There is no ways that I or any of us believe that he would have opted out. And that is why I've actually agreed to do this interview, to dispel any thoughts and rumours that this could have been a suicide.
However, the book's co-author Chris Steyn believes that he may have been compelled to take his own life.
I did come to the conclusion that he shot himself. This is not an official finding, this is my conclusion, that he did shoot himself, but I do believe that he was coerced in some way, that we're dealing with remote murder, that he was pushed over the edge, possibly by a threat to somebody close to him, possibly his daughter, and that he would have not hesitated if he had to choose between his life and hers.
Steyn says that after Minnie's death, she's even more committed to exposing the truth, as well as other revelations that she has since come across, suggesting that the extent of the scandal of the alleged pedophile ring is bigger than originally thought. She says the book is just the tip of the iceberg.
I don't fear for my life. I've had no direct threats. Many people in the old government, military, police, civil servants, have warned me that I ought to be afraid, that I should fear for my life, because they know how these things work. And it's not necessarily about what has come out, it's about what can still come out. It can also just be revenge for dismantling the statue of a poster boy of apartheid with a literary sledgehammer.
They've wasted our time, they've made our members to go on strike, they've made the public to suffer for nothing.
Andikwazi ukutya i-treatment ngendlela ngenxa into yoba imali ayikho. Ndifumene i-600 xa ndiphinda futhi ndidrowa ayiphumi ayikho kwakwi-account.
What we are experiencing now is due to the number of people accessing the system at the same time. So if they can just be patient for 3 to 4 days.
Special assignment. Crime keeps the society in terror and pain. Why so?
If someone phones me, tells me, okay, look here, you need a solver, and I get you all driving, I'll take it.
What pushes normal people to be so hard, heartless, and brutally kill one another?
The other side of it could be more for their own psychological need. It might be part of a sexual fantasy that they have. It could be about power and control.
After proper investigation is followed, the perpetrator gets arrested.
It's part of a massive process. And ultimately, they are parents, so I think justice is served.
Emotional scars remain.
We would pay any price to get him back, and the sad reality is that it's gone.
Special assignment. We unravel the truth every Sunday at 21:30.
We were saying similarly here, in a process which is intended to be impartial and independent, he should similarly recuse himself.
One can build conspiracies, and the fewer facts you have, the more easy it is to build conspiracies. And I suggest to you that when you're suggesting that there is some conspiracy about the witnesses were called, you might not have been aware of the facts that I've outlined to you.
Zimbabwe belongs to all Zimbabweans from all the four corners of Zimbabwe.
What a time! 1:54.26, another meeting record. She made it look effortless. Once again, Caster Semenya, no pacemaker required.
Our search for people who might know of living victims took us to the town of Uitenhage where Minnie worked in the 1980s. It is in this area that he wrote about having taken a statement from a concerned mother who came to report her son's rape in the 1980s. Hamilton Peterson, a former principal of Jubilee Park, a school in this area, vividly remembers hearing a disturbing report involving a group of boys at the school.
This was probably in the mid-80s. Not probably, it was in the mid-80s, that a report reached my ears that there were boys being sexually abused by so-called white men. I went to investigate the matter. There were two sets of boys. The one set knew about this whole event. The others were the participants. I went with the boys from the one to the other, took them with, and we had a discussion. And the boys, of course, denied what was happening. I couldn't take the matter any further at the time. I suppose the resources were there. But it's one of, the tragedies of the time that, these boys were poverty-stricken and they were being paid.
Hamilton says he first found out about the book The Lost Boys of Bird Island from the local newspapers. He was shocked at its revelations.
What went through my mind? One of my failings. I felt disappointed in myself in that I didn't pursue this thing, that I didn't think it that important at the time. They told me that they were being picked up by a white man in a bakkie near to McGuinness Park, which is in the center of town. It disturbed me deeply, but there was so many other problems, social problems at the school.
As a former political activist, Hamilton is baffled how the revelations that the book makes about the involvement of former cabinet ministers fell through the cracks, even though they came to light in 1987 when both Dave Allen and John Wiley reportedly committed suicide.
The TRC was a farce. TRC was an absolute farce because they never got around to getting to the criminals. And to say now that, I mean, everything is all right and Mandela forgave them, I didn't forgive them, really not. You know, I don't care if Mandela forgave them. I didn't forgive them. They killed our people.
The South End Museum in Port Elizabeth was set up as an apartheid museum that documents the devastating social and political effects that the forced removals of the 1950s had on this community. We spoke to the curator, Colin Abrams, about this specific period in the city's history when these crimes were allegedly committed.
The National Party and their cabinet ministers, they were well educated in that sense, that they could keep things quiet. You know, certain things were slipping out here and there, but I believe they were so good, and that is why they could subjugate and rule for such a long time, you know, and get away with it. They could do with our people what they wanted to do, and they would get away with it. So for them it was no problem if they had this defect in their lives, that they could take boys and abuse them on some private island and so on, as long as their own people don't know about it, but they could do that. And if they could do that, you can imagine what else.
It seems that decades later, the alleged ghosts of Bird Island are coming back to haunt the remaining members of the apartheid state. As the scars of the past remain opened and alleged victims remain missing, these revelations may be claiming more victims than expected.
The first time I met him, I had forgotten about it because, you know, he didn't really help me. He confirmed it off the record and I couldn't use it. So, but when I dropped Magnus Malan's name, Mark got such a fright that he shouted at me, "F*** off you, you're going to get me killed." And it's funny, when I stood next to his body 31 years later, I felt that if I had not, it wasn't me who had him killed, but the story did cause his death. If we had not done the book, it wouldn't, I don't think he would have taken his own life. So, yes.